and he never thought he will fit for the kingship, and he will never fit for this job what God is asking. He will never fit for the job Samuel shared, and so he don't have to be anointed. Even Jesse didn't give an opportunity for this David to come even while the celebration started, and he completely he avoided his son, we can see, and because of Jesse's frame, and Jesse put a frame, and this guy he only good for looking after the sheep. He is not good for anything. And so that's the way Jesse thought about whom David, we can see. So we put a people in different frame sometime, and so she cannot do that, he cannot do that, he is not good for anything, and he's a couch potato, and so many ways we and label people and put them in a side, and so because their appearance maybe, and we never look at their call. But here God is not looking at the smell of a sheep. God is not looking at the height or a weight or how handsome you are. God is looking at the heart of the people, and so he knows what is happening inside of the heart, and God looking always inside of our heart than the outward appearance. And here so Jesse framed David, he is only good for, shepherding or looking up the sheep, and then, when we come to Eliab, so chapter, 16 and verse 28, somebody can read chapter 16, 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 28. Yes. And now, what is happening in this chapter, and there was a fight, going on, with Israelites and the, Goliath, we can see 40 days, and there was a struggle. And so in that time, and Jesse, sent David, to his brothers, and so, and check the welfare of your brothers and how they're doing, and bring some report. And so Jesse had, packed, some food, for, this brothers. And so he went, with this bread, and, something special, maybe Jesse's, family made for, this brothers, those who are in the military. And because the, the fight, the challenge is going on between Israelites and Goliath. And so, and when, David heard that, from father, and go and meet your brothers. And so he was so excited, and he thought, oh, this is a good opportunity for me to see my brothers and see the battle. And so he went there, and so he thought Eliab, his brother, will receive him, and brother will be more excited. But here we can see Eliab, his brother, put him in another frame. And so here Eliab, when he reached, asked, his oldest brother Eliab heard what he said to said to the men, and he became very angry. And David and said, why you come here? And so he is asking, why you are here? And so then with whom you have left those few sheep in the desert, and so you are irresponsible and you are not taking your responsibility. And why you supposed to be there looking after the sheep, and why you are here? And then he said, I know of your pride and the sin of your heart. And so some other translation says your pride and wicked. And Eliab put David in a frame called a prideful or a arrogant and wicked guy. And so Eliab thought he is a proud and wicked. And so Eliab labeled him, and I know your pride and your wickedness and your heart. And so Eliab labeled him like that, proud and wicked. And so so he didn't have any compassion. He didn't have any love. And so, David maybe thought, why he's shouting, at me. And I bought a food, for him. And I didn't come, here. I came with the dad's, permission. And our father only sent me, here. I was so obedient to him. But my brother is shouting at me, why you are here? And so who is taking care of the sheep? And then called him, addressed him, you are wicked and arrogant, you are prideful. So Eliab, his brother framed him, as a arrogant or a wicked, guy. And then, when you come to Goliath, how Goliath, framed, David, we can see different people, are putting, David in a different frame. And sometime, early days, we used to frame, the pictures, photographs. And in early days, I remember, we have to buy a roll, to put, Nikon cameras and all. And then after finishing all the, taking pictures, then we have to take, special shop, they have to develop, this in a dark, room and all. And then, it can be, 4 into 6 or 10 into 12, so then we go and buy a frame, from the shop, to put, these pictures. And so nowadays we don't do that, very much, so, and here that is, frame, for pictures. But here, people are putting, real man in a frame, here, we can see in different, frames. And here, Goliath, what he did, 1 Samuel, chapter 17, verse 42 and 43. And so here the fighting is going, the battle is going on. And so chapter 17, verse 42 and 43. And he looked, David, over and saw that he was a little more than a boy, and glowing, with health and handsome, and despised him. And then verse 43 says, he said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And the Philistines, cursed, David by his, gods. And then, here, we can see in that, I don't want to, read other passages. The time is running out. And so here we can see Goliath, looks, at David, and said, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And here, Goliath looked at, him as a untrained guy. And he cannot fight with me. He's coming with a stick, and you are not a trained, in military. How can you come and fight? You are coming with a stick, am I a dog? So, Goliath said, so Goliath put him, in a frame called, you are not good for, fighting for a battle. You are an untrained guy, so that was, Goliath, label, we can see. And then, another labels also we have to look, so the Philistine cursed, David by his gods, we can see. And so here, we can see, another frame. And 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 14 to 23. And when we read that, we can see now, and verse 14, now the Lord's, spirit had left Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord, tormented, him. And some people may ask, how come God, sent an evil spirit? God has an evil spirit. No. And this is, really you need to understand, this is not an evil spirit. It's a kind of a depression, a soul was, going through. And so, in that, a depression time, and he will feel so gloomy and down, and someone need to, play maybe harp. So when, somebody play, harp, it is a kind of therapy, for, actually for a soul. And so here, when Saul was going through this hard time, depression and gloomy stage and very hard time, the spirit, tormented, him, and there is no happiness, in him, even though, he was a king. And suddenly, and so King, Saul heard, and there is a man named called David, and Jesse's son, and he is a shepherd boy, but he plays, harp, very well. And so he asked, and someone to go from his, kingdom or from his office, go to Jesse's home and bring, that harp player, who can play, the harp. So when, he will do that, so souls can be comforted and, some joy, can, bring to, his heart. And so, and in his depression stage, and so Saul thought he is a good harp, player. And so even, here, we can see Saul, could not see a king in him. And Saul thought he's a musician. David is a musician, and so bring him here so he can play, harp. That will, help me. So verse 16 says, an evil spirit from, God is tormenting you, and your majesty, why don't you command us to look for a man who can play the, harp well? And when the evil spirit, from God, comes to you, he will, strong, to tune, and you will feel, better. So here, we can see, Saul saw, David as a therapist, and come and do this, playing harp, and so, help him, in his situation, with, depression, stage. And so Saul could see only, him as a harp, player. And, just in my modern, modern, language, I say, and therapist. And so here, different people saw David, differently. And his father saw him as a shepherd, boy. And his, brother, saw him, as a arrogant and wicked, And so, and Goliath, saw him as a untrained, a guy. And so here, we can see Saul, saw him, as a harp player or a musician or, a therapist, who can come to, a king's palace and play, harp. But none of, those people could not see, so David as a king. But God was preparing a king, behind the scene. Dear friends, sometimes people may not see you as, God, sees you. But, behind the scene, God is training you. God is preparing you. But don't complain. Don't murmur. Don't, fight with, And when Eliab said, I know your heart. You are a wicked and you are prideful. But David didn't say even a one word, and he moved, from there, him. That's, we read, in the Bible. And then, so again, this Saul, saw him differently. And we can see when we come to verse, chapter 16, verse 19. And so here, and David, played a music for Saul when we read there. And then, when we come to chapter 18, could you please turn to chapter 18, and chapter 18 verse 8 and 9. And here when we read that passage, and so, Saul put him as a harp player and a musician or his therapist. And second frame, Saul made for him as his enemy or a threat. And so here what happened, the Saul became very angry because David had a great victory fighting with this Goliath. Goliath came down and killed him. And so it was a great victory for Israel. And then that victory happened here. The women's were singing. And so, and what they were singing, they said they have given a David honor for the 10,000s, but for me only thousands. And here we can see the 10,000s and 1,000 is huge difference. So when Saul heard that song, the sisters were singing, and suddenly verse 9 says, and Saul was jealous and did not trust David, from that, day on. And here, what happened? Just because of that song, he heard, and so 10,000 and 1,000, and suddenly, and there was a jealousy came into the heart of Saul, and so he became, his enemy. Now, so even though he was a harp, player, for him, musician, therapist in the palace, for him, and suddenly when David, had a great victory, he could not stand. He could not accept that. He could not tolerate. He could not appreciate, King, David. And so suddenly he became a enemy, instead of, loving. And here we can see, and so Saul now put him in a frame called, you are my enemy. You are a threat to my throne. And so you are trying to take my throne in the days to come. I'm not going to allow, so here, we can see. And Saul, put him, in a frame called, enemy and, threat. And then, when we read chapter 23 onwards, 1 Samuel, 3-4 chapters, 10 years, David had a hard time, dealing, with, Saul, we can see he was running just like a dog, hiding in, places, to save, his, life. And here, dear friends, what Saul saw and threat to his, throne. And so sometimes leaders or bosses, and pastors may frame you as a threat, when God, promotes you. I had seen in a church, sometime a capable, brother is there who can minister, and suddenly, so that person became a threat to a pastor. I had seen many times, even, in the organizations, in a huge work, place, set up, and, good, places. We call it's a beautiful office, good office, and all. But when somebody became a threat to a, higher person, and so that boss, cannot be happy sometimes. And the boss, even senior pastors, even senior leaders, that, we have been very, very often, in a Christian, circle. But, so whose frame are you living in, this morning? Just could you please, close our eyes, and in whose, frame, are you, living? You just, think, yourself. And Jesse, thought David is insignificant and a shepherd, boy. And so Eliab, thought a proud and wicked, and Goliath, saw him as a untrained, and Saul saw him as a therapist or a musician, or a, threat to, his, throne. And but, here, this morning, God is, encouraging each one of us. Man looks, at the outward appearance, and but the Lord looks, at the heart.